What's one family saying or phrase you heard growing up that still sticks with you?
The first sign that this Christmas was going to be different arrived not with the usual half-hearted card from my parents, but with a message from my brother, Mark, that lit up my phone just as I was pouring my morning coffee. The text was short, but the words were sharp enough to slice right through me. Christmas dinner is no place for losers. Don't bother showing up. I stood there for a moment, staring at the screen as the steam curled upward from the mug in my hand. My pulse raced, but outwardly, I kept my composure. I typed back only 2 words, got it, and set the phone down with the kind of calm that only comes when you've already been preparing for disappointment for years. The truth is, this wasn't the first time I'd been left out, ignored, or treated like I didn't belong. But something about seeing it spelled out bluntly, with no effort to soften the cruelty, made my chest tighten in a way I hadn't felt since I was a teenager. Growing up, Mark had always been the star. He was the golden boy, the son who could do no wrong, while I was the quiet shadow on the sidelines. If Mark brought home average grades, they were still praised because he tried. If I came home with straight A's, it was, well, that's expected, isn't it? At family gatherings, the stories were always about Mark's big wins, his charm, his future. When I got accepted to college on a scholarship, my mom told the room, it's good she didn't have to take out loans. We really couldn't have afforded much help. I learned early to swallow the bitterness and pretend it didn't matter. But now, all these years later, the old patterns had not only survived, they had hardened into something more vicious. The family had a rhythm, and I was still the one they left out of the dance. I spent that Christmas Eve walking past houses lit up with warm yellow lights, hearing faint echoes of laughter and carols behind closed doors, and wondering what was happening inside my parents' home. I imagined the table set with Mom's heavy white dishes, the roast glistening in the center, and my father pouring himself a glass of wine while Mark held court, telling some story about a deal at work or his kids' achievements at school. I could almost hear the polite laughter, see the nods of approval. And somewhere in that glow, my chair would be conspicuously empty. The thought didn't sting as much as I thought it would. Instead, it carried a strange clarity. For years, I had worked quietly in the background, supporting everyone else, especially Mark, who never seemed to think twice about asking for help. He was the kind of man who could mock you to your face one day and call for a favor the next, confident that you'd say yes. And the shameful truth is I often did. I paid for things I didn't need to pay for. I excused behavior I shouldn't have excused. I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, if I kept showing up, if I kept helping, they would eventually see me, acknowledge me, respect me. That text made one thing very clear: they never would. I sat in my apartment that night, no tree in the corner, no wrapped boxes piled high, just the faint hum of the heater and the city lights spilling across my floor. I thought about how many Christmas mornings I had woken up alone, waiting for a call that never came, while Mark's kids ripped open presents in the chaos of wrapping paper and laughter. I thought about how my parents had told me once, without shame, that Mark needs more help than you do, as though my independence was a punishment instead of an accomplishment. And I thought about how easy it was for my brother to label me a loser when the truth was, he had no idea what I had been carrying for him for years, without complaint. When I finally pushed the mug aside and closed my laptop, I caught myself smiling. Not the bitter, broken smile of someone defeated, but the kind of smile that slips across your face when you realize a line has finally been drawn in the sand, and you are the one holding the stick. I whispered it out loud to the empty room, my voice low but steady. He has no idea what he just set in motion. The funny thing about being called a loser by someone who has no clue how much of their life has been propped up by your effort is that it doesn't break you the way they think it will. It frees you. And though the apartment was quiet, I felt a kind of electricity in the air, a promise that the story wasn't over, not by a long shot. Because I knew something Mark didn't, and when the truth came crashing down on him, it wouldn't be me sitting in the dark, wondering where I went wrong. It would be him. And that was a thought I was willing to carry into the long, silent night. I spent the day after that message moving through my apartment like a woman cleaning out a room she had quietly outgrown, opening drawers that held envelopes with words like tuition and orthodontics printed in tidy serif fonts, pulling up banking tabs that remembered me better than my family did, and tracing with a kind of grim curiosity the web of transfers, standing orders, and emergency top-ups that had, over the years, been stitched into a safety net beneath my brother's household while he joked at barbecues about being the provider, and while our parents nodded along as if the numbers backing his stories came from somewhere noble and inexhaustible rather than from my paycheck and my silence. The first discovery was almost funny in its efficiency, because I had set it up that way when Jessica called during a late winter 4 years ago, her voice brittle with embarrassment as she explained that the private school had temporarily changed its billing portal, which was code for they were late again and ashamed to say it. So I created a quiet solution that avoided the spiral of late fees and teacher side glances by authorizing a monthly automatic payment that never crossed their doorstep. After that came the orthodontist installment plan for their older girl's braces, a line item I had told myself was for the child and not for Mark's pride. Followed by the mortgage catch-up I once executed with a wire sent on a Friday afternoon so the bank's automated notice would not arrive on a Saturday morning when the kids were home to see their mother's face, and, like beads on a string, there were grocery gift cards that appeared in Jessica's inbox before holidays, sports registration fees that cleared in June, and the summer camp deposit I made last May so they would not have to explain to their son why he wasn't going like the rest of his friends. I did not rage or cry or compose a cinematic speech in my head, because there was nothing left to say that had not already been said to me in quieter ways for years, so I did the only thing that felt clean and final and mine, which was to pick up the phone and call the school's bursar to update payer information back to the legal guardians, to ask the orthodontist's office to remove my card from autopay and send future invoices directly to the household that received the services, and to log into the bank's bill pay system where I canceled 3 recurring transfers and scheduled a final note to myself that read, simply, "Let it fail," as if giving myself permission to allow gravity to do what I had been preventing it from doing all this time. Because I had learned to build systems that erased my presence, undoing them left barely a ripple, yet each confirmation email that landed in my inbox felt like the sound of a latch slipping into place. And with each click I remembered a conversation I had swallowed, the afternoon our mother said, in that tolerant way she uses when pretending to be fair, that Mark carries more weight, and that I should be proud to be self-sufficient. Or the evening my father pulled me aside and told me not to make a scene when Mark forgot to pay me back for the furnace repair because he's under a lot of pressure, as if pressure were an explanation rather than a habit. And somewhere in the middle of those recollections I realized that my revenge did not need to be loud or theatrical. It only needed to exist where the truth lives, in the line between what people say and what their accounts reveal. So I wrote one email, careful and polite, to Jessica alone, not to embarrass her but to put the responsibility back where it belonged, telling her that I would no longer be handling administrative payments and that the school, the medical office, and the mortgage servicer had been notified to contact the household directly. I did not mention the text or Christmas or the word loser. I did not accuse or justify or bargain. I simply provided the information a competent adult would need to run their home, and I signed my name without the usual apologetic sentence I used to include about hoping things got easier soon. Then, because I could not resist one measured stroke that was not cruel to the children yet unmistakably precise in its message, I contacted the community center where Mark had been praised at a fall banquet for sponsoring the youth basketball jerseys, a sponsorship I had quietly paid for through my small consulting LLC after hearing him boast about giving back, and I asked the director to correct their donor record to list the actual payer for the upcoming season's banner. The woman on the phone sounded surprised, but not confused. She thanked me for clarifying, and she told me the new banner would be delivered to the gym on the first week of January, which I pictured not as a trophy for me, but as a mirror Mark would be forced to pass on his way to the bleachers. It would be easy to argue that the children did not deserve to feel the tremors of adult pride cracking, and I agree with that more than anyone, which is why I timed my cancellations to avoid abrupt interruptions. set end dates that wouldn't pull a rug from under a child in the middle of a semester, and left a cushion I could live with, not because Mark earned it, but because I refused to borrow his style of punishment. Yet I also knew that if I kept cushioning forever, then nothing would change. And there is a difference between being kind and being a permanent human shield for a man who calls his sister a loser while standing on her invisible scaffolding. When I finished, the apartment felt different, lighter and slightly echoing, as if a piece of furniture had been removed and the walls could finally breathe. So I made dinner and ate it at my table with the window open to the winter air, and I allowed myself the small, guilty relief of imagining Mark opening a tuition email in January and realizing there is no invisible hand moving money into place, imagining him rehearsing explanations for Jessica that do not include me, imagining my parents practicing the language of neutrality and discovering they no longer speak it as fluently as they thought, and in that quiet a plan formed that was less plan than posture. A decision to answer questions with questions, and to let their words show in daylight what they have always been in the dark. The revenge, if that is what we are calling it, took its first breath that evening when I forwarded the community center's corrected donor acknowledgement to Mark with a simple line that read, "Thought you might want the update for the next banquet." And then I put my phone face down on the table and let my home be quiet, a quiet that lasted exactly long enough for a new notification to appear from Jessica, whose subject line contained no greeting, only my name, a question mark, and a sentence. That suggested she had just discovered something that would make this winter far more interesting than any of us had expected. Jessica's email was not a polite inquiry crafted to maintain appearances or buy time until she could consult Mark's preferred version of events, but a long and breathless paragraph that read like someone trying to hold together a house whose nails had begun to slide out of the wood, because she laid out dates and balances and the cheerful euphemisms used by school administrators when tuition fails to arrive. And she confessed that a series of tidy auto payments had always materialized like clockwork from an account she never had to open, and she asked, in a tone that wavered between gratitude and accusation, whether I had in fact been the tide lifting their boat while her husband posed on the dock with a captain's hat and a speech about responsibility. I did not respond with a confession or a lecture, since both would have centered me as the villain or the savior, and I was finally done auditioning for either role, so I called her and listened, really listened, while she described the particular humiliation of learning from a school secretary that invoices had reverted to legal guardians, and the shock of seeing the orthodontist's portal request a card she did not have, and when she paused long enough to breathe, I said, as gently as the truth would allow, that the money had always been a bridge, not a deed, that it was created to carry children across a narrow river, not to build a highway over a canyon Mark kept digging with his pride. She was quiet for a long stretch that carried the weight of a decade of small recognitions that had been filed away under loyalty, and then she admitted that she had believed the story they presented every Sunday at church and every spring at the school fundraiser. That Mark earned and provided and protected, while I floated somewhere in the periphery with my career and my independence, a word her friends said with admiration and her in-laws said with the polite pity reserved for women who refused to be supervised, and when the silence threatened to calcify into complicity, I told her, not angrily but with the finality of a ledger closing, that I had stopped, that there would be no more soft airdrops of cash into holes labeled emergency or last time, and that I expected Mark to call me not with a creative fable, but with the decency to name what he had done. She exhaled something like a laugh that did not reach humor, and she said she would handle the kids, and I said I believed her. And for a second we were not rivals in a family drama, but two women standing in a cold kitchen staring at the same overdue notice, both realizing that the system had been designed by someone who never planned to pay the bill himself. Within days the public fabric began to loosen, because image is thread and pressure is a seam ripper, so the community center posted the corrected sponsor banner for the Winter League. And the new vinyl rectangle hung above the free throw line with my small company's name printed, where Mark's had once appeared like a seasonal halo, and the first time he walked into that gym, which I know he did because he cannot resist a spotlight even when it threatens to blind him, the parents on the Bleachers performed those subtle micro-theatrical gestures, an eyebrow raised, a glance down, a whisper into a sleeve, that announced the arrival of a rumor that is very likely true. Our mother phoned me after that game with a voice tuned to the frequency of moral disappointment, and she suggested, with her usual delicate authoritarianism, that I correct the record because people are talking, and I told her, evenly and without decoration, that the record had been corrected, which is why people were talking, and that if she preferred a silence better suited to the old narrative, she could ask her son to pay a bill in his own name and watch how quickly the volume drops. Jessica reached out again, this time more measured, explaining that the school had granted a short grace period, that the orthodontist would not remove brackets mid-course, that the mortgage servicer had offered a stern phone call instead of a letter that a child might open by accident, and that she had arranged a meeting with Mark to discuss their budget without the fairy dust of invisible support. And she asked whether I would be willing to join them, not as a banker but as a witness, because she suspected that the moment Mark faced facts, he would try to perform a scene, and that a sister's presence could force honesty like stage lights force actors to hit their marks. I said I would come, not to referee a marriage but to end an era, and I arrived at their kitchen on a pale afternoon that smelled like last night's coffee, bringing nothing but a stack of printouts with the identifying numbers blacked out and the totals left intact, because I wanted the story to be readable without being theatrical. Mark tried swagger first, a familiar routine in which he reframed generosity as control and labeled my boundaries as mood swings, but numbers do not blush or apologize. So when Jessica placed the school invoice beside the orthodontist schedule beside the bank statement, the choreography collapsed into something ragged and graceless, and he shifted to the old family script that calls me sensitive, unstable, and difficult. The adjectives that mothers employ when daughters refuse to be furniture. Only this time Jessica did not nod along, and my father was not there to say, be the bigger person, and the kitchen did not carry the old acoustics, and I felt the strangest sensation, which was not triumph or revenge, but something steadier. The knowledge that a lie can be loud for a long time and still die in a soft voice. I told him, in one unbroken sentence that held every December I had spent waiting for an invitation that never came, that he had walked into my phone with the word loser and handed me the cleanest decision of my life. That I would no longer subsidize a man who required applause to open an envelope, that I trusted Jessica to protect her children without resorting to the emotional blackmail our parents used to keep me small, and that if he respected even a fraction of the image he curated on social media, he would call the bursar himself and discover the tone used with adults who pay their bills on time. He tried laughter next, a brittle kind that evaporates when it meets air, and then he reached for anger, because anger has always been his favorite mask, but anger cannot argue with timestamps, and when it failed him he turned to pleading. A quiet pleading that did not summon pity so much as it summoned a strange calm, because the man who had branded me unworthy of a chair at Christmas was asking for a chair at a table built with receipts he had never read. I left him there with his wife and the stack of paper that weighed much less than the years it represented, and as I stepped out into the late afternoon light I realized that the next call would not come from Jessica, and it would not come from our mother either. Because the center of gravity had shifted, and there is only one person who dials when he sees a spotlight slipping away, and when my phone began to vibrate with a name that might, under other circumstances, have made me soften, I let it ring until the sound cut off. Then I watched as another message arrived bearing the same impatient insistence he once used to get me to fix his life, and I opened it, not because I planned to comply, but because I wanted to see exactly how a man begins to beg when the echo in the empty gym finally answers back. The first time Mark appeared at my door after everything unraveled, he still carried that brittle swagger that had always shielded him from accountability, the posture of a man who assumed the very act of showing up was enough to reset the balance of power. But behind it I could see the cracks beginning to spread across his face like fractures in thin glass. He stood on my porch with a smirk that tried to mask desperation, holding his arms wide as if I might step into them, and when I didn't move he shifted quickly into the language of family, insisting that we can't let small misunderstandings divide us. as though the word loser was simply a mispronounced syllable rather than a knife carefully aimed at the most vulnerable part of me. I leaned against the doorframe, coffee in my hand, and let him talk, because there was something profoundly satisfying about watching him circle through arrogance, denial, and unease without my intervention, like a performer flailing on stage when the script has vanished and the audience is unmoved. When arrogance failed, he reached for pity, explaining in a low voice how the children were asking questions he didn't know how to answer, how Jessica was confused by sudden bills, and how unfair it was that I would punish innocent kids because of his bad wording. I let the silence stretch between us until it became unbearable, and then I asked him the question he had never once expected to hear. What exactly have you been telling them about where the money comes from? He faltered, not because he lacked an answer, but because the only answers available to him were lies already exposed. His mouth opened and closed, searching for the rhythm of his usual performances, but the words never arrived, and in that silence the truth became louder than anything he could have invented. By the third visit, the mask of composure had completely slipped, and the driveway became his stage for a spectacle he couldn't contain. He raised his voice, demanding that I fix the mess I had created, drawing the attention of neighbors who peeked from their windows at the sight of the golden sun unraveling in broad daylight. He paced, gestured wildly, and shouted fragments of sentences about betrayal and family obligations, all while the winter wind carried his words across the cul-de-sac like gossip already formed into headlines. I remained inside, watching through the glass with a calm I had never felt before, realizing that the punishment he feared most was not financial loss, but the exposure of his fragility. The image of strength collapsing in front of an audience that had once applauded him without question. Our parents entered the scene not long after, calling me with the soft authority of people who believed they could still dictate the terms of peace. My mother's voice was thick with guilt disguised as diplomacy, urging me to be the bigger person because families survive only when someone bends. I almost laughed, not out of cruelty but because I had already bent so many times that my spine should have snapped years ago, and I told her that I had, in fact, been the bigger person for a decade, carrying more than anyone acknowledged, and that my decision to step back was not an act of malice, but of survival. My father added his own plea, wrapped in the language of tradition, reminding me that blood is thicker than water, but I reminded him that blood can also stain, and that pretending not to see it only makes the mark spread. Mark's begging grew less coherent as the weeks passed, shifting from loud public tirades to quiet messages delivered at odd hours of the night, each one a little more frantic than the last, as if the silence he received in response was more devastating than any insult I could have hurled back. He alternated between threats of cutting me off completely, an empty gesture since he had already done so at Christmas, and pleas that I not ruin everything for him, as though the ruin had not been authored entirely by his own arrogance. Jessica, to her credit, stopped trying to mediate once she realized that no negotiation could erase the receipts lying in her kitchen drawer, and her calls became less about reconciliation and more about logistics, practical discussions about bills and schools that excluded Mark's voice altogether. There is a peculiar kind of revenge in refusing to fight on someone else's terms, in choosing instead to let them wrestle with the silence they created, and every time Mark pounded on my door or filled my voicemail with half-coherent demands, I felt that revenge deepen, not because I wanted his suffering for its own sake, but because he had built his entire identity on the belief that I would never stop carrying him, and now he had to confront the unbearable truth that the scaffolding was gone. The irony was sharp enough to taste. The man who had once looked me in the eye and told me Christmas was no place for losers was now reduced to begging daily at the door of the very person he had dismissed. A reversal so complete that I didn't need to gloat or explain. The night he left his last message, a long, rambling plea that swung wildly from anger to tears, I sat at my table, the same table where I had once signed checks and wired funds to keep his life intact. And I understood that the real battle had never been about money at all. It had been about dignity, about who held the power to define worth in a family that had always weighed me by the wrong scales, and now, for the first time, the definition was entirely mine to write. I didn't pick up the phone to respond, not because I lacked words, but because silence was louder, sharper, and infinitely more honest. And as I set the phone down, I knew this was not the end of the story, because men like Mark do not collapse quietly. They drag everyone with them in the hope that someone, anyone, will still catch them before they hit the ground. I chose a diner with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like someone had burned a memory into water, a place so ordinary it could never be accused of staging. And I asked them to meet me there on a gray afternoon when the sky pressed low enough to make even loud people quiet. So when my parents slid into the booth across from me and Jessica sat beside them with the taut composure of a woman who had learned to breathe through a fire alarm, and Mark arrived last with his jaw clenched as if the act of chewing contrition might break his teeth, I kept my hands flat on the table and let the waitress pour coffee into every cup before I spoke. Because I wanted the ceremony of normal life to be the frame around something that would no longer be performed. I did not come with speeches or threats, only with a folder of papers whose weight came not from ink but from time, and when I opened it I did not fan the pages like a deck to be played for effect. I simply laid down receipts and confirmations the way a person lays down cards in a game she has finished playing, slow enough that everyone could read the dates and the descriptions and quietly understand that what had been called luck and leadership in our family was, in fact, logistics and labor performed by someone none of them had ever bothered to think. Mark reached for bravado as if it were oxygen, declaring that this was a misunderstanding engineered by outside influences and that airing private matters in public was beneath me. Which almost made me laugh because my entire existence in this family had been a series of private matters cleaned in private rooms while he collected public applause, but I let the words pass like weather and pivoted not to accusation but to structure, explaining carefully that effective immediately I would not be funding, fixing, or laundering emotional messes, and that any obligation I felt toward the children would be honored in a way that never again required me to step into his narrative, because I had met with an attorney and established a simple, boring, ironclad mechanism that did not care about his performance, a trust in the children's names that would pay tuition and specific educational expenses directly to the institutions, that could not be rated for vanity purchases or mortgaged against a performance bonus that never arrives, and that would continue only if I was left entirely out of the family myth-making, which meant no more triangulating calls from our mother, no more private strings attached to public gestures, and no more holiday invitations calibrated to humiliate. For a long moment nobody spoke, and even the grill seemed to hush, and then Jessica exhaled as if she had been holding the breath of an entire winter, and my father nodded in that small, unwilling way men nod when a woman has forced them to reconsider the definition of responsible, and my mother said my name with a tremor that sounded like an apology that had grown old living inside her. Mark tried anger next, a clumsy thing that made the silverware rattle, asking who I thought I was to insert lawyers into a family matter. And I told him I was the person who had been asked to silently subsidize his pride for longer than anyone in this booth cared to count, and that the trust was not a punishment, but a reprieve for the only people in this story who had done nothing wrong. And that if he wanted to be a provider, he could become one by paying a bill in his own name and discovering that dignity is built in small, unphotographed acts, not in speeches at school gyms. He shifted, as I knew he would, to pleading, promising that if I would just undo the paperwork, he could fix things. And I said that the paperwork was the first honest thing any of us had done in years, and that it would remain, and that what he did next would decide whether the story we told about our family finally included the part where the quiet one stopped being furniture. I pushed one final envelope across the table, not for him but for our parents, a letter that did not accuse but accounted, listing with dates and amounts the times I had intervened and the reasons I had kept it private, and asking them to stop confusing my silence with consent. Because the girl who learned to keep the peace had grown into a woman who refused to keep the lie. He stared at the trust summary as if staring could turn legal language into smoke. Then he asked in a smaller voice whether the children would be embarrassed by their mother accepting money from me, a question that belonged to the theater of his pride, and I said no. Because the children would never be told the name of the pair, they would simply receive education without shame, and he could tell whatever story his conscience could carry, and if that meant inventing a raise or an inheritance. I would not waste one more hour correcting him, because the truth had already done its work. He winced, because he understood that I had built a structure he could neither control nor destroy, and that my revenge was not a knife but a boundary. And that boundaries are terrifying to people who mistake love for acquiescence. The waitress refilled our cups, my mother unfolded the letter as if it might cut her, and Jessica placed a hand flat on the table near mine, not to plead, but to steady, and for a moment I wanted to reach back, to create a new axis that did not run through Mark, and then I remembered the Christmas text and the years that made it inevitable, and I left my hands where they were. When I stood to go, Mark asked, almost politely, whether I would consider joining them for Christmas next year if he handled things, a phrase so vague it contained both promise and threat. And I said that invitations are not apologies and receipts are not absolution, and that if a year from now the children were steady and the bills were paid and my name had not been stapled to anyone's shame, we could have a conversation like adults in a room without a spotlight, but that I would not answer that question today, not because I lacked forgiveness, but because I was done giving answers that allowed other people to delay their own. Outside, the cold bit my cheeks and turned my breath visible, and my phone vibrated in my pocket with a message that appeared in fragments on the lock screen, a half sentence about being sorry and a half justification about pressure. And I watched the dots appear and vanish as he typed and erased and typed again, and I let the screen go dark without opening it, because sometimes the most honest ending is not a door slammed or a hug given, but a hallway left empty, a path deliberately unwalked, and the faint, relentless hum of a life finally stepping out of a house built on gratitude I was never allowed to claim.